Good morning. I want to thank everyone who's joined us today. I want to especially thank Ron Davis of 21st Century Policing, who's with us. 21st Century Police Solutions, who's with us because he's the one that's made all of this possible along with my internal team. And I'll get to introduce my internal team at the end of this. But I think what's important to note here is that we're about to embark on the second phase of our review of the Sacramento Police Department. And I'm glad that those of you who've taken the time to be with us will have an opportunity to listen in. And I hope you will share this report with your viewers, your listeners, your readers. And I hope that this is something that Californians, especially those in law enforcement, will heed and pay attention to. So let's go ahead and begin. As I said, after I finish my remarks, and they're going to be somewhat long, I'm going to turn it over to Ron for his remarks, and I'll introduce some of my team who's with me, including Chief Ed Medrano of the Division of Law Enforcement here at the California Department of Justice, who is available as well. As my father, a construction worker, used to say, if you want to make something permanent, you have to lay a solid foundation. And today's announcement is about just that for the community of Sacramento and for the state of California. It's about saving lives and making sure police departments have the best information and tools available to prevent unnecessary uses of force and shootings involving officers. Because here at the California Department of Justice, we know that the stakes are really high. We're talking about communities across the state and our families. And these kind of preventative efforts have to remain a point of focus moving forward for all of us if we're going to make a difference. So today we're issuing our findings and recommendations on the second of two reports on the Sacramento Police Department's policies and practices. We all have to work towards common understandings if we're going to strengthen that trust that we all seek and that has to exist to keep everyone safer in our state. And that includes not just our communities, but our officers as well. And that's part of what we're striving to do with this latest report, which builds on the one we released some 18 months ago, January of 2019. You may recall that report. Back then, our report included recommendations to, one, ban chokeholds, carotid restraints, I always want to say carotid restraints, and any body positioning intended to cut off the flow of oxygen or blood. So it's not just the chokehold, right? And it's not just the carotid restraint, which blocks not just air, but blood. It's about any body positioning intended to cut off the flow of oxygen or blood. It was also about requiring de-escalation when possible before using force. It was about providing explicit guidance on proportionality, including through the potential adoption of use of force matrix that help guide officers and police departments on where to go, how to scale things up and down. It provided for requiring verbal warning when feasible before using lethal or less lethal force. It also prohibits shooting at or from moving vehicles, providing only for exceptions that require such actions to end an imminent threat to human life. It called for discontinuing bite and hold canine techniques in favor of circle and bark techniques, where police dogs are trained and deployed to alert by circling and barking at a suspect until the handler takes control. The report also called for requiring that deadly force be used only as a last resort when reasonable alternatives have been exhausted and are not feasible. It called for requiring peace officers to intervene to stop excessive or unnecessary force by another officer. Many of those recommendations on use of force policies, on training and practices have been reiterated in today's report, and were also part of our statewide call for action just this past month. This work has been critical in helping us pave the way and pave the path forward on a number of very significant police reforms. And this latest report is part of a broader collaboration effort to help the city of Sacramento and the Sac PD set the standard for innovation and reform in policing. It's not about just being sufficient as a police department. The department here in Sacramento, California, well, they've asked for our help to excel, and that's a critical point. This is about being accountable and meeting the call for change. It's also about stepping up to make a difference when we're confronted by tragedy, because the shooting death of Stephon Clark back in 2018 was exactly that, plain and simple, a tragedy. But we already know that this effort has helped make a difference. And the Sacramento Police Department has already put it into place and at work many of the changes we're calling for. Importantly, it has also inspired legislation that will make some of our previous recommendations the law of the land here in California. Nevertheless, this report vastly broadened the scope of our review to include a look at bias prevention, personnel complaints and investigations, officer discipline, early intervention efforts for officers, data management and recruitment, hiring and retention of officers. And we also examined data on use of force incidents involving Sacramento Police Department officers from 2013 to 2018, as well as in-depth reviews of a sample of more than 100 less than lethal use of force incidents. The purpose of this latest review that we're announcing today has been to highlight areas in which Sacramento can continue to work to improve through evidence-based recommendations, including on, as I've mentioned before, some of these restraints on the use of tasers and on the use of canines. Some of the key findings and recommendations made to the Sacramento Police Department today, well, they include calls to, one, revise their use of force policy to more closely reflect the meaning and intent of the new law under Assembly Bill 392, which redefined the legal standard for authorized use of force in California. We also recommend that they make de-escalation an affirmative duty, particularly in light of findings that a number of their use of force incidents here in Sacramento involve people who failed to comply with orders but did not otherwise pose any danger. Recommendations concluded conducting a comprehensive study in an effort to understand the causes of apparent racial disparities involving their stops, arrests, and use of force here in Sacramento, where Black Americans were involved in 43% of SACPD's use of force incidents between 2013 and 2018, but only made up 13% of Sacramento's population during that same period. Recommendations also included expanding partnerships with mental health and social welfare professionals, given that in 60% of the cases we reviewed, officers perceived the subject of a stop to be in some type of altered mental state. What else? Reevaluate personnel misconduct categories to ensure that SACPD's misconduct classifications are specific and accurate, given concern that overly broad categories have been used in other jurisdictions to potentially mask more serious behavior, such as dishonesty, that can later have significant implications regarding the credibility of that officer, for example, in testifying in court. Another recommendation, allow supervisors to directly refer officers into the early intervention program as appropriate in order to address any problematic performance patterns without being required to wait for a triggering event that meets a certain threshold before proactively working to help an officer. That's critical. We shouldn't be waiting until we see problems really surfacing. What else? Ensure that all recruitment materials emphasize messaging aimed at attracting ideal candidates who are motivated and equipped to serve the public and prioritize the sanctity of life above all else. Given that recruitment brochures focusing on images like military-style armored personnel carriers tend to lead to the recruitment of candidates who may be more likely to use unnecessary or disproportionate force. Another, regularly assess which parts of the hiring process disproportionately affect underrepresented groups, including reassessing physical agility standards to ensure that they appropriately measure real-world physical demands on the job, rather than utilizing measures that, for instance, may disproportionately create barriers for female candidates. These are some of the items. They scratch the surface of what's contained in our latest report. And our partners across the strait, I have a message for you. I urge you to read our recommendations and build on them. They mark an important step in our broader work to advance systemic reform, and we hope that leaders at all levels of law enforcement will stand with us to implement these critical changes, because it's work that is built on real experience at the California Department of Justice, including, for example, our collaborative review initiative of the San Francisco Police Department, taken on because of the Trump administration's abdication of police reform efforts. We also engaged in a new review and a reform effort to improve and strengthen the policies and practices of the Vallejo Police Department, in light of numerous high-profile officer-involved shootings. We just announced that within the past month. We're also engaged in a pattern or practice investigation into the Kern County Sheriff's Office and the Bakersfield Police Department. That is ongoing. We reached a historic desegregation agreement not long ago, about a year ago, with the South Toledo Marin School District, if you can believe that, desegregation agreement. The last desegregation agreement in California took place 50 years ago, but that discrimination is still going on, and that's why this agreement was so important. You are probably familiar with the ongoing independent review that we have with the Los Angeles Police Department. Take a look at its records and policies regarding the use of the Cal gang system to track potential gang members, as well as our work drafting the new regs, the new regulations to oversee the Cal gang system statewide. And we announced over a year ago a settlement to curb inequalities committed against students of color and students with disabilities at the Stockton Unified School District through the police force that they have. And that was a crucial way to deal with the confrontations that the schools have with their kids and trying to deal with them in ways that are less harsh and punitive towards these kids. Ultimately, we want to be able to grow up and be productive citizens. Again, much more. We have the experience here at the Department of Justice, and we're going to take these lessons to help build a better criminal justice system for all Californians. Because when we are given the resources, when we're given an assignment, and we are tasked with personnel and the equipment to get it done, we're going to swing for the fences and do our work to the best of our ability, because that's what it means to stand up for the people of California. Our goal is to drive real, lasting change to address the legitimate anger and the frustration and fear that's expressed by people of color throughout our country. The path to rebuilding trust obligates us to steer towards meaningful, sustained action to make a difference. And over these past few weeks, we've learned and been reminded of what's at stake when it comes to how we provide for the public safety of our communities. The recent police officer involved deaths of Black Americans and people of color like Breonna Taylor, Rashard Brooks, George Floyd, they all demand that we confront the realities of systemic inequalities and racism, on top of the ongoing pain caused by an unprecedented pandemic. But make no mistake, many of these challenges are not new, and here in California, we're not immune to these issues. They have been with us for far too long and are all too familiar. Whether it was the shooting of Eula Love in 1979, the beating of Rodney King in 1991, or the death of Stephon Clark, we have to find a better way forward. The people of this nation and California deserve it. We have to reckon with police brutality against Black people in this country and the systemic failures that cause and allow this misconduct to perpetuate. And that's part of why we're here today. While much work remains to be done, I commend Sacramento Police Department Chief Daniel Hahn and the City of Sacramento for collaborating in this deep dive that DOJ took into the Sacramento Police Department. We must all strive to be an example of the change that we desperately need. And I'm grateful to our partners in the private sector, academia, and government for helping make these reports and recommendations possible. Now, it's up to all of us across the state to step up and work to make these reforms a reality. This moment demands it. People of this state demand it. And we must let our actions speak louder than our words. And so I'm very fortunate to be able to tell you that we're going to speak loudly because we've got a document that does that talking for us, and now we put that into action. And very little of this would have been possible had our internal team not been able to reach out to some of the best experts, those with the real experience on this. And for that reason now, I'm going to turn this over to Ron Davis, the former director of the Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services at the federal level at the Department of Justice with President Obama, whose team has played a significant role now in the private sector as he consults. It was their role that made this work and this report possible. So let me turn it over now to Ron Davis. Ron?
Thank you, General. Let me start off by thanking you for your leadership and that of your outstanding team. It was a pleasure working with them to achieve the review and the recommendation that we're providing. I'm going to start with something that you mentioned earlier about San Francisco, about the collaborative reform. Why this work is so important. As the General mentioned, I served in the Obama administration as the director of the COPS office, and then he appointed me as the executive director of the President's Task Force on 21st century policing. In my capacity as the cops director, we led the collaborative reform of the San Francisco Police Department among 12 to 15 other agencies at that time. As the Attorney General mentioned, however, we finished the first assessment and provided some 272 recommendations that the Trump administration walked from that, all of collaborative reform, and in general, the police accountability initiatives. And California was the first state. This Attorney General was the first to step up and said that we will fill in the gap of the leadership void that is now in DC with regards to policing and police reform. And so California has led the way with, was it volunteer oversight, whether it's pattern practice at the state level, whether it's AB 392 on use of force, or SB 230 that focuses on training. So I want to thank you, General, once again, for your leadership and for taking on this project. I think it's also critical to thank Sacramento PD. As a former police chief, I can tell you there's no harder request than to ask someone to critique you, to criticize you, and to find fault in things that you're doing. But that's a true sign of leadership. We have an old phrase that the truth often hurts, but selective ignorance is fatal. Not knowing is more dangerous than the pain that sometimes hearing the hard truths can provide. And so I think when we look at this process, what makes this very special, there was two pieces of a necessary pie. The first part focused on what I call front end, what we call front end accountability, policies and training, how officers are really hired and trained to do a job. But that doesn't mean much. Policies become nothing more than paper if you don't have the back end accountability. And that's where we looked at how they're supervised, internal affairs, how complaints are received, what kind of disciplinary processes are in place, looking at the use of force activities themselves to see if the sanctity of life in fact is a priority. So these two pieces of the puzzle put together give you a good idea, not just for the Sacramento Police Department, as the Attorney General mentioned, but for California law enforcement. And I have very comfortable to say for all 16,000 police departments in the United States that operate very similar, that have some of the same challenges. It is a good roadmap on how to start that reform process. I think it's notable that many of these recommendations were given before the most tragic incident, because here in California, we recognize that it's not the most recent crisis that drives an agenda. It's the idea that we have systemic failures and systems that have had long-standing negative impacts on communities of color. And so that commitment remains and stands strong. And I want to thank once again, the state of California for its leadership. As you look at this report, please do not look at it in isolation. Take a look, a refresher, take a look back at the first report to see how we flowed with looking at the policies, the training, the recommendations, to actually looking at cases and some of the recommendations that go with that. I will ask that the Sacramento Police Department take this report as serious as they did the first one, take a lead in this state on how to implement reform while working very closely with their community. And I think as we watch them do their work and the work that is also going on across the state at every level, I think we can learn a lot more for how our 400 plus agencies in California can do a tremendous job, and we can provide for the state. So with that, I don't have much to add, General, other than say, once again, thank you for allowing my firm, 21st Century Policing Solutions, to participate. We work all over the country. This was an exciting project because of the leadership, because of the collaboration, because of the outcome, and most importantly, we know that it's going to have a significant impact throughout not just the state, but through the country. Thank you, sir.
Ron, thank you. And again, we're fortunate that you decided to devote your career to doing this, because it's showing results. And my sense is that while before we were talking about putting forward a template and giving folks a sense of best practices, today I think most people hear this stuff and it resonates. It's no longer some weird book or something they're not familiar with. And I think that's a sign that people are beginning to recognize that these reforms are what we need in the 21st century. So let me, if I can take a moment before we go to questions, just acknowledge some of the team at the Department of Justice that work with Ron and his team to make some of this possible. A few of them will be available in the event that there are some questions that get into some detail that I think Ron and I would prefer to let some of the folks who actually were down deep inside doing this work. I already recognized Chief Ed Medrano of the Division of Law Enforcement here at the Department of Justice, Michael Newman, who is a Senior Assistant Attorney General, who really takes charge of all these issues involving civil rights enforcement for us I want to thank him and his team. I know Susan Slager was with him, Cherokee Melton, also both supervising deputy attorney generals working on some of these things. They have a team that's been tremendous in doing this work. Christine Sun, who's a special assistant to me, special assistant AG, just again stays on top of these things. Randy Chance and her people at the research center, she's a director. They've done some tremendous work for us. You need to have data. You need to back what you're saying with real heft. And as I said, that foundation has to be strong. And Randy Chance and her team were just incredibly important to us. Let me now just mention one final thing, and then we'll go to questions. This was not a report meant to be printed and put on a shelf. I know that Chief Hahn at Sac PD is making use of it. I've spoken to Mayor Darrell Steinberg here at Sacramento, and I know he wants to make sure it's being implemented. I will tell you this, I hope everyone will use this, maybe not as a Bible, maybe that's going a little bit too far, but certainly as a foundational document to help you move forward and address those concerns in a way that build that trust that we all want to see. And so with that, let's move to questions, Bethany, and see where we go.